There's a specific moment, quiet, unremarkable, when you're sitting alone on a Saturday night and you realize you haven't spoken to anyone in days. And instead of panic, you feel relief. Deep, undeniable relief. For years, you showed up. You went to dinners, answered texts, kept friendships alive like they were fragile plants that would die without constant care. But somewhere along the way, you started to notice something unsettling. Most of those connections felt like background noise. Not meaningful, not nourishing, just there, filling space, draining energy you didn't have to spare. The philosopher Schopenhauer once observed that solitude is the fortress of the highly sensitive. Not because they hate people, but because most social exchanges cost more than they return. And after decades of trying, you've begun to see it. The friendships you thought mattered were often just performances you'd agreed to attend. You weren't connecting. You were maintaining appearances. But here's what most people never realize about this shift, and it changes everything. Stay with me, because what you're about to understand isn't loneliness, it's clarity. Let's go a little deeper. When you were younger, friendship felt different. It felt necessary, like oxygen. You believed that having people around you meant you were doing life correctly, that a full social calendar was proof of worth, that being invited somewhere, anywhere, validated your existence. So you went. You showed up to birthday parties for people you barely knew. You attended dinners where the conversation felt like work. You laughed at jokes that weren't funny. You nodded through stories you'd heard 3 times before. You performed interest. You performed enthusiasm. You performed connection. Carl Jung called this the persona, the mask we wear to meet the world's expectations, the version of ourselves we present in public to gain acceptance, approval, belonging. And for a while, you thought that's what friendship was supposed to feel like, that everyone else was doing the same thing, that this was just how social life worked. But the persona is exhausting to maintain, because it's not who you are. It's who you think you need to be to survive socially. And the longer you wear it, the heavier it becomes. You'd come home from a night out and sit in the silence of your own space, and instead of feeling lonely, you'd feel relief. Like you'd been holding your breath for hours and could finally exhale. Like you'd been performing a role in someone else's play and could finally step off stage. And that's when the guilt would arrive. Because you weren't supposed to feel this way, were you? You were supposed to miss people. You were supposed to crave connection. You were supposed to feel energized by social interaction, not drained by it. But you didn't, and you started to wonder if something was broken inside you. Here's what most people never say out loud. There's a difference between being alone and being lonely. And there's an even bigger difference between having friends and having friendships that matter. You can be surrounded by people and feel utterly alone. You can have a contact list full of names and no one to call when something real happens. You can spend years maintaining relationships that never go deeper than surface-level pleasantries and polite updates. And at some point, after enough years of this, you start to realize something uncomfortable. Most of your friendships weren't real connections. They were social contracts, obligations, performances you'd agreed to participate in because that's what people do. Schopenhauer understood this deeply. He wrote about how most people mistake proximity for intimacy, how they confuse shared space with shared understanding, how they believe that simply being around others is the same as being truly seen. But it's not. Real connection, the kind that nourishes rather than drains, is rare. It requires more than just showing up. It requires vulnerability, honesty, the willingness to be seen as you actually are, not as you think you should be. And for people like you, that kind of connection is so rare that you've stopped looking for it in the usual places. If you've ever felt relief when plans were cancelled, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That instant, undeniable sense of freedom when a text comes through. Hey, can we reschedule? And instead of disappointment, you feel your shoulders drop, your chest opens, Your whole body relaxes because you didn't want to go. You never wanted to go, but you felt obligated. You felt like saying no would make you a bad friend, a bad person, someone who doesn't care. So you said yes, over and over, for years, for decades, maybe, until one day you stopped. Not dramatically, not with some big announcement or confrontation. You just quietly stepped back. You stopped initiating. You stopped responding as quickly. You stopped forcing yourself to show up to things that felt like chores. And you waited to see who would notice. Most people didn't. This is where the psychology becomes unmistakable. When you stop being the one who reaches out, you discover something brutal. Many of your friendships were one-sided. You were the glue. You were the one keeping things alive. And the moment you stopped performing that role, the relationship dissolved. Not because anyone was cruel, not because anyone intended harm, but because the friendship was never built on mutual investment. It was built on convenience, proximity, habit. Jung would say you were holding up both personas, yours and theirs. You were doing the emotional labor of maintaining the illusion of connection for both people. And when you stopped, there was nothing underneath to hold it together. This realization can feel devastating at first. Like you've wasted years on people who never truly cared. Like you've been fooling yourself into believing you had a community when you were really just part of someone else's background noise. But here's the shift that changes everything. This isn't loss, it's clarity. You're not losing real friendships. You're shedding performances. You're releasing obligations that were never serving you. You're making space for something deeper, quieter, and infinitely more real. Before we continue, I want to say something important. This quiet shift, this realization that most of your friendships were just noise, is happening all over the world. To people who spent decades believing they were supposed to be different, who thought something was wrong with them because they didn't crave constant connection. But you're not alone in this, and you're not broken. If this resonates with you, I invite you to join this quiet corner of the internet, a place for people who choose solitude over half-hearted connections, who understand that being alone doesn't mean being lonely, who've learned that peace is more valuable than popularity. Share in the comments what part of this resonated most with you, because your words matter, your experience matters, and there are others here who understand exactly what you're feeling. Let's continue, because what comes next is where everything becomes clearer. There's a specific kind of freedom that comes with this realization, a freedom most people never experience because they're too afraid to step away from the noise. But you've stepped away, and in that space, you've discovered something profound. You don't actually miss most of the people you used to spend time with. You don't miss the forced conversations. You don't miss the obligatory check-ins. You don't miss the exhaustion that followed every interaction. What you miss, if you miss anything at all, is the idea of what those friendships were supposed to be. The fantasy of deep connection, the hope that one day someone would truly see you. But the reality never matched the fantasy, and at some point, you stopped waiting for it to. Jung believed that true individuation, becoming who you really are, requires you to remove the persona and face what he called the shadow. The parts of yourself you've hidden, the preferences you've denied, the truth you've been too afraid to speak. And one of those truths is this: you don't need as many people as the world told you you did. You don't need a full social calendar to feel whole. You don't need constant validation to know you matter. You don't need to perform connection to prove you're capable of it. What you need is peace, clarity, the freedom to exist as you actually are, not as you think you should be. And that freedom is only possible in solitude. Pay attention to this part. The moment you stop seeing solitude as a problem and start seeing it as a choice, your entire relationship with yourself shifts. You're no longer someone who can't make friends. You're someone who refuses to settle for shallow connections. You're no longer someone who doesn't fit in. You're someone who values authenticity over acceptance. You're no longer someone who avoids people. You're someone who protects their peace. This isn't semantics. This is a fundamental shift in how you understand yourself. And it's the difference between shame and sovereignty. For years, you carried shame. You believed that your preference for solitude was a flaw, that your inability to maintain friendships meant something was wrong with you, that your exhaustion after social interaction was proof that you were broken. But you weren't broken. You were just forcing yourself into spaces that didn't fit. And now that you've stopped forcing, you've discovered something most people never find: the joy of missing out. Not FOMO, JOMO. The quiet, undeniable relief that comes from choosing your own company over someone else's expectations. There's a moment that happens when you fully embrace this shift, a moment when someone invites you to something, and instead of feeling obligated to say yes, you simply don't. You don't make excuses. You don't apologize. You don't feel guilty. You just say no. Or you don't respond at all. Because you've finally given yourself permission to prioritize your own peace over someone else's comfort. And the first time you do this, it feels terrifying. Like you're breaking some unspoken rule. Like you're letting people down. Like you're proving that you really are as selfish and antisocial as you feared. But then something unexpected happens. Nothing. The world doesn't end. The friendship doesn't collapse. The person moves on. And you realize that your presence was never as essential as you believed it to be. You were replaceable. And instead of feeling hurt by this, you feel free. Because if you're replaceable in their life, then they're replaceable in yours. And you no longer have to carry the weight of maintaining something that was never mutual to begin with. This is where the real transformation happens. When you stop seeing yourself as someone who lost friends and start seeing yourself as someone who released noise, your entire internal narrative changes. You're not lonely, you're selective, you're not isolated, you're intentional, you're not broken, you're clear. And this clarity, this deep, unshakable understanding of who you are and what you need, is something most people spend their entire lives searching for. But you found it, not by adding more, but by subtracting everything that didn't serve you. Schopenhauer believed that the highest form of wisdom is knowing what to avoid, and you've learned this through lived experience. You've learned that avoiding shallow friendships isn't antisocial, it's self-preservation. You've learned that choosing solitude isn't giving up on connection. It's refusing to settle for less than what you deserve. And what you deserve is depth, authenticity, reciprocity, the kind of connection that nourishes rather than drains, the kind of friendship that doesn't require constant maintenance because it's built on mutual understanding, not obligation. And if that kind of connection is rare or even non-existent in your life right now, that's okay, because you'd rather be alone than surrounded by noise. I want to talk to you now, not about you. If you're reading this and recognizing yourself in every word, I need you to hear something. You're not doing life wrong. You're not failing at friendship. You're not broken. You're not too sensitive, too introverted, too difficult, too much, or not enough. You're someone who's been forced to navigate a world that values quantity over quality, a world that rewards constant connection and punishes those who need space. A world that treats solitude as something to fix rather than something to honor. And after years, maybe decades, of trying to fit into that world, you've finally given yourself permission to stop. This isn't giving up. This is waking up. You're waking up to the reality that most friendships are transactional, that most connections are surface level, that most social interactions are performances designed to maintain appearances, not build intimacy. And once you see this, you can't unsee it. You start to notice how much energy you were spending on relationships that never gave anything back. How much time you were investing in people who never truly saw you. How much of yourself you were sacrificing just to feel like you belonged somewhere. And you realize belonging isn't worth it if it requires you to abandon yourself. There's a quiet kind of power that comes with this realization. A power that most people never access because they're too afraid of being alone. But you're not afraid anymore. You've learned that being alone doesn't mean being lonely, that solitude isn't isolation, that choosing your own company over half-hearted connections isn't selfish, it's self-respect. And this self-respect changes everything. It changes how you show up in the world. It changes what you're willing to tolerate. It changes who you allow into your life and what you expect from them. You're no longer willing to settle for friendships that feel like chores. You're no longer willing to perform interesting conversations that bore you. You're no longer willing to sacrifice your peace just to avoid being seen as difficult. Because you finally understood something most people never learn. Your peace is more valuable than their approval. And once you know this, truly know this, you become untouchable. Not in an arrogant way, not in a cold or detached way, but in a way that says, I know who I am, I know what I need, and I'm no longer willing to compromise that for anyone. This doesn't mean you'll never have friends again. It doesn't mean you're destined to be alone forever. It doesn't mean you've given up on connection. It means you've raised your standards. You've learned that real friendship isn't about frequency. It's about depth. It's not about how often you see someone. It's about how seen you feel when you're with them. And if that kind of friendship doesn't exist in your life right now, that's okay, because you'd rather wait for something real than settle for something empty. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And in many ways, that's what you've done. You've removed the persona. You've stopped performing. You've stopped pretending that shallow connections are enough. And in that removal, you've found something most people spend their entire lives searching for: peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from having everything you want, but the kind of peace that comes from no longer wanting what doesn't serve you. So here's what I want you to understand. The day you realize your friendships were just noise isn't a day of loss. It's a day of liberation. It's the day you stop apologizing for who you are. The day you stop forcing yourself into spaces that don't fit. The day you finally give yourself permission to choose solitude over performance. And in that choice, you discover something profound. You were never broken. You were just trying to live according to someone else's definition of connection. But you don't have to anymore. You can build a life that honors your need for quiet, your need for space, your need for depth over breadth, your need for authenticity over approval. And that life, that quiet, intentional, deeply peaceful life is not only possible, it's already here, waiting for you to fully step into it. But there's something else happening beneath this realization, something most people never address. Because once you've released the noise and found peace in solitude, a new question emerges. What do you do with all that space? When the calendar is empty and the phone is silent and the house is yours alone, what fills that void? Is it creativity, reflection, growth? Or does it become something heavier, something harder to name? Because solitude, when chosen consciously, can be a sanctuary. But solitude, when it stretches too long without purpose, can become something else entirely. And the line between the two is thinner than most people realize. That's what we'll explore next, because the psychology of solitude doesn't end with relief. It deepens into something far more complex. And if you've felt that shift, if you've tasted the freedom and then wondered what comes after, you'll want to stay for what's coming. A quiet corner of the internet for people who choose solitude over half-hearted connections.